Christopher switched off the lamp in his law office, the city lights of Philadelphia twinkling below. It had been 18 years since his sister Evelyn, an investigative journalist, had vanished while building a case against a powerful CEO, and the silence of her absence still echoed in his life. He had channeled his grief into a career in corporate law, a world she fought against, just to feel close to the shadows that took her. That night, a call from a cold case detective would change everything, referencing an item a construction crew had just pulled from a century-old sewer main, a warped plastic bag containing a microcassette recorder. A story like this makes you wonder about the secrets hidden just beneath our feet, in the forgotten corners of our cities. Before we uncover what was on that tape, I'd love to hear your own thoughts on what happens when a person's search for truth leads them into the path of powerful people with everything to lose. Christopher's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to shake his entire body. His grip on the phone was so tight, his knuckles were white. "A recorder?" he managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. "Are you sure?" The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the sound of a man who had delivered difficult news for decades. "We can't be sure of anything yet, Mr. Sanders. My name is Detective Anthony. I'm with the Philadelphia PD's cold case unit. A city crew is doing a major overhaul of the sewer system down in the old industrial sector. They were working on a main trunk line, something that hasn't been touched since it was laid over a century ago. They pulled up a package. It was sealed. We'd like you to come down to the precinct to see if you can identify the contents." Christopher didn't need to ask what the other item was. The detective's careful omission spoke volumes. They had found something that pointed to a person, to his person, to Evelyn. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, his voice firm now, the lawyer in him taking over, pushing down the terrified younger brother. He hung up the phone and stood, the view from his 40th floor office suddenly feeling like a cage. For 18 years, he had surrounded himself with the architecture of power, gleaming steel, polished mahogany, the quiet hum of money. He'd learned the language of the men Evelyn had fought against, mastered their rules, and earned their respect. He told himself it was a way to understand, to be prepared if the truth ever surfaced. But in his honest moments, he knew it was a fortress he had built to hide from the gaping hole his sister's disappearance had left behind. On his desk, next to a stack of legal briefs, was a framed photo. In it, a woman with a defiant smile and intelligent eyes held a notepad and recorder, interviewing a man in a suit on a busy city street. Evelyn. She was vibrant, unstoppable. The photo was taken a week before she vanished in the fall of 1997. She had been working on a story about a chemical company, a rising star in the corporate world called Cooper Industries. Its CEO, David Cooper, was a charismatic figure, a pillar of the community. Evelyn had suspected something dark beneath the polished surface. She talked about poisoned water, about sick families living downstream from his flagship plant on the Delaware River. She said she was close, that she just needed one more piece of evidence to tie it all together. Then she was gone. Her car was found in a parking garage downtown. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses. The police investigation had been thorough but fruitless. They interviewed David Cooper, who had a rock-solid alibi, a charity dinner attended by half the city's elite. With no body and no direct evidence, the case grew cold. The narrative settled into two unsatisfying possibilities. She had run away to start a new life, or she had been the victim of a random, tragic crime. Christopher had never believed either. Evelyn would never run, and her disappearance felt anything but random. It felt calculated. He grabbed his coat, his mind a whirlwind. After nearly 2 decades of agonizing silence, a sound was finally emerging from the depths. The drive to the precinct was a blur. Christopher parked his luxury sedan between 2 weathered police cruisers, the contrast feeling stark and symbolic. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Detective Anthony was waiting for him. He was older than he sounded on the phone, with tired eyes that had seen too much but missed nothing. He led Christopher not to an interview room, but to a small, sterile lab. On a steel table under the harsh glare of an overhead light was a large evidence bag, and inside it was a smaller, warped plastic pouch. It was thick, almost like an industrial sample bag, and its edges were melted together in a crude, uneven seal. The plastic was cloudy with age and filth, but through it, Christopher could see the outlines of what was inside. Detective Anthony spoke softly. The city crew said it was wedged in a feeder pipe connecting to the main trunk. That line has been sealed off for repairs for at least 50 years. A major pressure surge from the new excavation work must have dislodged it. It's a miracle it survived at all, let alone with the contents somewhat preserved. An officer wearing latex gloves carefully cut open the evidence bag and then, with a scalpel, sliced through the melted seal of the inner pouch. A faint, musty smell of river mud and decay filled the air. The officer used forceps to lift out the first item. It was a small, black microcassette recorder, an Olympus Pearl Quarter L400. Christopher's breath hitched. "That's hers," he whispered. "She called it the truth machine. She took it everywhere." He remembered the day she bought it, how excited she was by its small size. "Perfect for getting the story without them seeing it coming," she had said with a wink. The second item the officer pulled out was small and metallic, tarnished with age. It was a tie pin. It was silver, fashioned into an elegant, abstract shape. As the officer gently wiped away the grime, a set of initials became clear, intricately engraved on the surface. D.C. Christopher's blood ran cold. "David Cooper," he said, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. He looked at Detective Anthony. "You have to know what this means. She was investigating him when she disappeared." The detective nodded grimly. "We knew. We just couldn't prove it. Cooper was untouchable back then. Still is, for the most part. He's a major philanthropist now, sits on the board of half the charities in this city. A model citizen." "He's a killer," Christopher said, the words coming out with a certainty that had been buried for 18 years. "The question is," Detective Anthony said, gesturing to the small recorder, "can she still prove it?" The next few days were an agonizing wait. The police lab's audio specialists worked carefully, their task delicate. The microcassette tape was fragile, damaged by moisture despite the sealed bag. They had to source a vintage player, clean the tape, and painstakingly digitize the audio, millisecond by millisecond. Christopher couldn't work. He couldn't sleep. He sat in his silent apartment, the fortress he had built now feeling like a prison, and waited. He kept seeing Evelyn's face, hearing her laugh, remembering their last conversation. He had warned her to be careful. "These are dangerous people, Ev," he'd said. She had just smiled that fearless smile of hers. "The truth is always dangerous, Chris. That's why someone has to tell it." Finally, the call came. Detective Anthony's voice was tense with excitement. "We've got something. You should come down." Christopher was in his car before the detective had even finished the sentence. Back at the precinct, he was led into a small sound lab. Detective Anthony and a young audio technician were waiting. "It's not perfect," the technician warned. "There's a lot of background noise, and the quality degrades toward the end. But it's audible." He pressed a key on his computer. A hiss filled the room, and then a voice. Evelyn's voice. It was clear, confident, and so painfully alive it felt like a punch to the gut. "The documents don't lie, Mr. Cooper," she was saying. Christopher realized from the sounds of lapping water and distant traffic that she wasn't in an office. She was outside, somewhere near the river. A man's voice responded, smooth and controlled. It was David Cooper. "Documents can be misinterpreted, Evelyn. You're a smart reporter. You know that." "I also know what a spectrograph is," Evelyn retorted. "I had the samples from the river tested. The chemical markers are a 1-to-1 match for the waste produced by your plant. A specific byproduct you swore in federal court you were no longer producing." There was a pause. The calm in Cooper's voice was gone when he spoke again, replaced by a hard edge. "You're playing a game you can't win." "This isn't a game." Evelyn's voice was firm, unwavering. "People are getting sick, David. Children. I've spoken to their families. I have the medical reports. I have the proof." David's voice dropped to a low, menacing snarl, a sound that made the hairs on Christopher's arm stand up. "You have no idea what you're messing with." The next sound was a sudden, sharp shuffle, the sound of a struggle. Evelyn let out a short, surprised cry. There was a thud, and then nothing. The technician let the silence hang in the room for a moment before stopping the playback. Christopher stared at the speakers, his hands clenched into fists. 18 years of uncertainty had just collapsed into one horrific, undeniable moment of truth. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been the victim of a random crime. She had been murdered. And the tape was her final defiant act of journalism, a message sent from beyond the grave. "It's him," Christopher said, his voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "It's proof." Detective Anthony shook his head slowly. "It's a powerful lead, a motive, a confrontation. But it's not proof of murder. His lawyers will say they argued, she left, and something happened to her later. They'll say you can't prove he laid a hand on her from this recording." Frustration burned in Christopher's chest. The detective was right. After all these years, David Cooper was still untouchable, protected by his wealth and his lawyers. "So what do we do?" Christopher asked, looking from the detective to the silent speakers. Detective Anthony picked up a small evidence bag from the console. Inside was the tarnished silver tie pin. "A good lawyer would tell you we need to connect him to the scene of the crime," the detective said, a new glint in his tired eyes. "We need to prove this pin belonged to him and that he was wearing it that day." Christopher looked at the pin and then at the detective. The grief and rage swirling inside him began to solidify into something else. Purpose. He was no longer just the grieving brother. He was a lawyer, and he knew exactly where to begin. "Leave that to me," he said. For the next week, Christopher disappeared from his own life. He put his cases on hold, ignored calls from his firm, and immersed himself in the world of 1997. He knew that to a man like David Cooper, public image was everything. He would have been photographed constantly, especially during the period when his company was on a meteoric rise. Christopher's first stop was the archives of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the newspaper where Evelyn had worked. He spent days scrolling through microfiche, the grainy black and white images of a bygone era flashing before his eyes. He found dozens of photos of Cooper at galas, press conferences, and groundbreaking ceremonies. Cooper was always impeccably dressed, but the photos were often too blurry or taken from too far away to get a clear look at his accessories. Just as his hope began to fade, a librarian suggested he check the society pages and lifestyle magazines of the time. It was a long shot, but Christopher was desperate. He found a bound collection of a glossy local magazine called Philly Style. He flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages, the scent of old paper filling his nostrils. And then he found it. It was an issue from October 1997, just 2 weeks before Evelyn disappeared. The feature was a multi-page spread on the annual Children's Hospital Charity Ball, the very event Cooper had used as his alibi. There, on page 32, was a large, high-resolution photo. David Cooper stood with the mayor, a champagne flute in his hand, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. And there, glinting under the photographer's flash, was the tie pin. It was unmistakable. The abstract shape, the silver sheen, the intricate design. It was the same pin. Christopher's heart leaped. He carefully scanned the photo credit and article text, his legal mind looking for anything to corroborate the date. The caption beneath the photo read, "CEO David Cooper and Mayor Rendell at the first annual Children's Hospital Charity Ball held on October 15th, 1997. He had it. A dated, published photograph of David Cooper wearing the pin just before Evelyn vanished. It was the link, the piece that tied the pin from the sewer directly to the man on the tape. He took the magazine to Detective Anthony, his hands shaking slightly as he laid it on the detective's desk. Anthony stared at the photo, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Mr. Cooper has a problem." Armed with the tape and the photograph, they were finally ready. The police brought David Cooper in for questioning. Christopher insisted on being there. Citing his role as his family's legal representative, he was granted permission to watch the interrogation from behind a two-way mirror. He watched as Cooper, now a man in his late 60s with graying hair but the same arrogant posture, walked into the interview room flanked by two expensive-looking lawyers. He was the very picture of calm, untouchable power. For the first hour, he coolly denied everything. He claimed not to remember the specifics of his conversations with Evelyn. He vaguely recalled her being a persistent, slightly reckless reporter. When Detective Anthony presented the tie pin, Cooper simply shrugged. "I've owned many tie pins over the years. I may have lost that one. It was a long time ago." But then, Detective Anthony signaled to the technician. He pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the small room. Christopher watched Cooper's face intently as he heard his own menacing words from 18 years ago. A flicker of something, panic, maybe fear, crossed his features before he caught himself, his face becoming an impassive mask once more. When the tape ended, one of his lawyers immediately spoke. "This is an outrage. That recording is inadmissible. It could be doctored. It proves nothing." But Detective Anthony wasn't finished. He slid the magazine, open to the charity ball photo, across the table. You were wearing the pin 2 weeks before she vanished, David, the same pin found with her recorder. Cooper glanced at the photo and sneered. A coincidence. You have nothing. Christopher felt a surge of despair. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe the man was going to walk away again. But then, Detective Anthony played his final card. He placed a new file on the table. When we recovered the bag, we didn't just analyze the contents. We analyzed the bag itself and the sediment trapped inside it with the recorder. He opened the file, revealing a detailed chemical analysis report. Your company, back in 1999, produced a very specific cocktail of industrial waste. It contained a unique chemical marker, a stabilizing agent you developed to make the waste easier to transport before dumping. It's like a chemical fingerprint. Our forensics team found that exact same chemical marker, in concentrated form, in the mud and water sealed inside that bag. The room fell silent. Cooper's lawyers looked at each other, their confidence suddenly gone. The bag was sealed at the crime scene, David, Detective Anthony said, his voice low and steady. It was sealed with your victim's last words and your chemical fingerprint. You didn't just drop her recorder in a random storm drain. You dropped it in a drain that fed directly from the area around your plant, the same place you took her life. Christopher watched as the color drained from David Cooper's face. The arrogance, the composure, the mask of power he had worn for 18 years finally crumbled. The untouchable man was trapped. The truth, which he had buried deep beneath the city, had finally come back to the surface. In that moment, through the one-way glass, David Cooper looked up, his eyes wide with defeat, and for a split second it felt as though he was staring right at Christopher. Then he slumped in his chair and began to speak. A few months later, the autumn leaves were turning gold and red along the banks of the Delaware River. Christopher stood at the water's edge, in a quiet, secluded spot that the police had identified as the place where Evelyn had spent her final moments. David Cooper had confessed to everything. In a fit of rage at her refusal to be bought or intimidated, he had struck her, causing her to fall and hit her head on a rock. Panicking, he had weighted her body down and sunk it in the deepest part of the channel. In his haste, her recorder and his tie pin, which had come off in the struggle, fell to the ground. He had scooped them into an industrial sample bag from his car, sealed it shut, and shoved it down a nearby storm drain. A single act of hurried concealment that had ultimately been his undoing. Cooper was sentenced to life in prison, his philanthropic legacy forever erased by the truth of his crimes. Standing by the river, Christopher felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in 18 years. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sadness and a deep sense of pride. He had quit his job at the corporate law firm. The fortress of steel and glass no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a monument to the very thing that had taken his sister. In its place, he had used his inheritance and his legal expertise to establish the Evelyn Sanders Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding and providing legal protection for investigative journalists taking on powerful interests. It was a legacy of truth, not of power. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal. He knew they would never recover Evelyn's body, but somehow it no longer mattered as much. She wasn't lost in the depths of the river. Her legacy was in the stories that would now be told because of her, in the truths that would be brought to light. He took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, and for the first time in a very long time, felt like he could finally breathe again. It's often said that justice delayed is justice denied. But in a case like this, where the truth surfaces after nearly 2 decades, do you believe the final resolution can still bring true peace to those left behind? Thank you for joining us for this story. If you'd like to explore more cases where the past refuses to stay buried, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation.